All right, well, welcome everybody. It's 6:30. It's that time to get started with our program. I want to welcome everyone. My name's Mark Barnico. If you haven't been here before, I'm the executive director of the campus, and I'm really excited that we have Professor Ken Pomerantz here this evening. He's our faculty director. He just arrived today. He'll be here for about 10 days. He comes about 4 times a year, and we work very closely together on a lot of our programming, including the ones that we're working on and presenting tonight, which is a talk on rationality and context, behavioral economics, and cognitive bias from east to west, just so you know that you're in the right place. As always, we're sharing this program on Zoom. So we have a Zoom audience this evening, Facebook and YouTube. We're live on those platforms as well. So this is the second Nexus lecture that we had. Nexus Asia is a program that Ken and I worked with the team here in Hong Kong to develop, which actually is really unique for us, I think, across the UChicago network, because we feature our UChicago PhD alumni and the institutions that they work with throughout the Asia Pacific region. And we do that through lectures, academic workshops, and research. So we actually, found some resources, pulled a network of about 110 PhD alums from UChicago in Asia Pacific together, and we asked them to submit grant proposals, and we funded 10 of those proposals. So tonight's the second talk that we have for Nexus. Last week we had Clifton, who's in our audience tonight. He gave a great talk, and so we'll have several more talks, 8 more talks after tonight, stretching all the way through until November. So we're happy to have this evening Professor Shali Wu. She's our Nexus Scholar this evening. I've already given the topic, but let me introduce Shali. She's an associate professor at the Business School of Kyung Hee University in Seoul, South Korea. And she just got off the plane last night late as well. And we're really excited that you came to do this talk with us tonight. She earned her PhD in psychology and a master's in science, MS, statistics from the University of Chicago. So she's got deep roots both in a master's and a PhD at the University of Chicago. Her research lies at the intersection of behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, cross-cultural decision makers, and she investigates how cultural contexts shape rationality, cognitive biases, and economic behavior, with a particular focus on East and West. So we love the fact that you bring both the Eastern and the Western perspective to this topic. She's published in the publication Science, which I'm sure many of you are aware of and know. And I actually learned that you are the author of a widely taught Harvard Business School case on consumer satisfaction and trust. So I'd like to get a copy of that when we get a chance. So that's great. And so let me invite Professor Wu to come to the stage and give her talk this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So can you hear me all right? Okay.
A little louder.
A little louder? Okay. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And I'm very grateful to be invited here as a Nexus Scholar. And also like to express my gratitude to University of Chicago. So I spent a good 10 years on campus, crossing from psychology, social science, statistics, physical science, and also School for Business. So thank you. Words cannot express my gratitude to the university. I'm very honored to be here today. So I'd like to start telling a short story. A tech executive, American tech executive, once shared with me one of his experiences collaborating with a Chinese team. So he came to China and delivered one of his best presentations, trying to seal a deal. It turned out after the meeting, no decision was made and the deal didn't get through. So he was very surprised. Days later, he learned that the Chinese team was offended. Not by the numbers he presented, but by his tone. So what he saw as confidence perceived by the Chinese team as disrespect. Yes, this is an example of perspective gap. So I hope to spend the next 30, 40 minutes given to me to share with you my research and my experience of how we may understand each other's perspective better, hopefully, and what might be some of the cultural gaps between the West and the East. See my get to I have this. So thanks to everyone for coming here today. I think there's a recent movie currently in the movie theater, Mission Impossible, Final Reckoning. And this is one of the scenes I like to pull out, the Madam President facing a difficult decision to make. But I tried to put it in a different scenario, which is something I just discussed with my students. I was telling Mark, I just finished my courses for this semester on business statistics and marketing management. So I like to discuss cases, real business cases with my students. And here's one of the case problems we face. Imagine we're all the decision makers for a company, and your company just made a lot of money. And you're thinking about bringing some of the money to some of the key candidates, A, B, C. And for candidate C, I guess no debate about how much money to give. But for candidate A and B, there's a different kind of scenario. For candidate A, he's highly connected. And without his connection to the government, this company is a construction company, the company wouldn't secure such a project and later on make big profit out of it. Candidate B is a very good engineer from the company. He drafted a very good proposal. Without his proposal, the project also wouldn't be possible. The issue is candidate A is from a very wealthy family with a high connection. Candidate B from poor family. On top of that, he just had some family issue facing a big medical bill to pay. So that's the scenario. If you're in the committee deciding how to allocate, let's say $100,000 to the candidate, how would you do? What decisions you'd make, right? So there are two proposals from the committee members. One is to allocate 10-50, that's say we focus on A and B. The other is 60-10, right, for candidate A and B. How would you allocate? Right. This is an opening question for all of us.
The 10.
Give each one of them
No, I'd go with A.
the proposal A.
The rich, wealthy person from a wealthy family gets less. And
less. That's interesting. Thank you, Mark. Would the rest of the group also agree? What about I argue? My counter argument is the wealthy person, yes, he may not need the money, but without his connection, there's no such a project for the company and no profit. So if he knows about this distribution of bonus, he'd get upset, and then there may be no future project for the company. Yes or no, maybe? What would you,
Interesting new information.
yes?
If the government awarded the project because of this person, even if that person wasn't offended, the government might be, if they got wind of the distribution. Tricky. Although I tend to agree with Mark that I'd want to do proposal 1.
Do we all agree? Let's say if we put in this real scenario, this is a multinational companies, and those who are involved in this decision making, the Westerners and Easterners. This is a real case, right? Westerners more into, right, helping the individuals in need and also gave the best proposal, or East Asians, right, may want to consider, right, the family situation candidate's real need, or thinking about the company's future, right? How do we define, I guess a lot of things can come into the discussion, fairness, what might be fair. Ultimately, what's gonna affect our decision? Right? There are many factors. We may think about people in need. We may also want to think about, I'd like to care about my company's future, right? If I reward the person in need, I need to be worried about tomorrow, other employees, or my future of my company. So there are some of the things one needs to consider. Ultimately, different factors may affect, right, the ultimate decision, but here there's some cultural factors, which is how much we consider, right, individuals like success or company success, or how much we consider individuals' needs, right? Those are the things that's worth considering. So I'd like to break my talk into roughly 4 parts, given the limited amount of time, to talk about why cross-cultural decision-making may matter. I think now the world has become more globalized, at the same time also more divided. So making decisions that's gonna maybe optimize. I think in business school, we talked about optimization. So what will help us to optimize? What do we optimize? We optimize the outcome, but which party's outcome? Individuals, the communities, institutions, all those things that's worth considering. When we're running multinational companies, people with different cultural backgrounds may prioritize different things. Family values or individual success, right? There's a few dimensions I'd like to bring up. And also with different intentions, motivations, ideas in mind. If we cannot really successfully understand the other party's perspective, there might be some issues, right? Then we're not just talking about some cultural hiccups, there might be some geopolitical breakdown. So one question I like to bring from the West is whether Westerners, so I have my talk on rationality. I think psychologists would like to look into human being making rational decisions. We all do, right? Not just psychologists. Economists have a different views of what might be the rational decisions. And I think in behavioral economics, Richard Thaler and psychologists at the business school at UChicago, a big string of the human beings being irrational. The good news is we can predict the irrationality. But we're proud of our reasoning. I think what's behind definition of rationality is how we reason. We feel there's a reason we make such decision. But what drives the decision, different people from different backgrounds may have different ideas. So if we focus on the Westerners, some questions may come into how, right, we think about our decisions. Is rational way of thinking indoctrinated in the society, education, or organization, right? The best basis. What basis we use for our decisions. So My point here, I guess I'm sitting at a very unique location, Hong Kong, combining the Western and the Eastern world in University of Chicago, and the campus in Hong Kong. And when we try to bring people from different parts of the world together, what criteria we use for the decisions can be debatable, right? I think in some of my marketing cases debate, we talked about should even individual try to maximize or satisfy, right? So we can maximize, or also we can debate about what to maximize. And some may feel like as long as I'm satisfied, that's good enough, right? So those by itself can be contradicting. So what basis to use, whether the Western standard is the best basis, or should we incorporate some of the Eastern views, for example, the family value, right? The collective community, so on and so forth. So I like to move on to some of the science behind the integration of decision-making, and starting from my own research. So 2007, Boyce and I published this article on cross-cultural decision-making on perspective taking. And during the last almost 20 years, 2 decades, I've been teaching marketing science. And a lot of us understand under marketing, we like to use the 4P framework. But I feel that framework is a bit problematic because it's clearly lacking of taking others' perspective. For example, if we, as a company, offer some products and services, we take a customer's perspective, then it's no longer just the product and services. It's what value can we deliver to the potential customers. Right? It's not just what we can offer, it's rather what the customers may derive value. Same with price. It's not what business can bring to the business. The price is a very important aspect of marketing. But rather, if we take customers' perspective, to customers, that's a cost. Right? That's why some companies may focus on lowering the cost. So maybe instead of the price, should it be the cost for business to think about if we consider customers' perspective. Place, it's not where we can deliver the services or products, or whether it's convenient for our audience, for the customers. Similar to promotion, right? Instead of promoting from the business side, it's rather of effective communication. So how customers understand the benefits from what you offer. So instead of 4P, I'd like to change it to 4 Cs, for example, right? Did I say C? Right, customer value, cost, convenience, and communication. So from that point on, and the science behind we did a little mini experiment in the lab on campus of University of Chicago, used eye tracking equipment. And what we found, I'd like to bring a little bit of a video to show how Americans and Chinese may play a bit differently when it comes to perspective taking. So there's a 4x4 grid. So the participants are sitting where you're sitting, and that's the view the participants could see. The director's view is behind, right? Some of the slots were blocked. So director's view is slightly different from participant's view. And the game goes by the participant will move the object and following director's view. Except the participant and the director, they have a different perspective. They see different things because some slots were blocked. So I like to show a sample Americans and Chinese performance in this little game.
Ready?
Ready.
Put the block with the Q-tips.
Okay. Which block?
The white one.
Oh, sorry. So the little orange circle captures the participant's eye movement. So the director instructed the participant to move one of the block, but actually the director could only see one block, the upper left white one. The upper right one was blocked from the director's view. So if participant fully considers the director's view, then shouldn't be distracted by the upper right block. Right? And that's what the participants, American participants asked, which block I should move. But the Chinese counterpart, here the next video shows.
准备好了吗？把方块放到棉签一起。对。
So exactly the same instruction, but in Chinese. So language may shape the way we take others' perspective, maybe. And later, we further analyzed the detailed eye tracking data. And what we found was universally, individual will start from your self-view, which is the most economical, right, efficient way of processing information, except that East Asians, Chinese, tend to be faster adapting to others' perspectives. And in this sample video, the Chinese very quickly identified the target block. So that indicates East Asians may be more attuned to others' perspectives. So that's the cross-cultural finding in my research. So I'd like to bring a bit more of the science behind cross-cultural thinking and intelligence. So a Dutch psychologist, Hofstede, came up with this, used to be 5 dimensions, now like 6 dimensions of the cultural differences. It's a power index, power distance, how we view people at a different, with a different power, right? The inequality being acceptable. And there's my own research about perspective taking directly from the individualism and collectivism, right? That's how we argued based on the fundamental individualism versus collectivism. East Asians, there are 2 competing hypotheses, and we found out East Asian may tend to pay more attention to others. Preference for achievement, competition versus cooperation and care. In my view, the 3rd and the 6th, like a context, like society's context, depending on where we grew up, how we, where we got our education, or in institutions environment, we tend to be driven by some of the forces, right? Some of us may, without really paying much attention, became more and more competitive, focusing more on self-achievement. But in some other environment, you may feel the cooperation is really promoted, right? And you care about others. Uncertainty avoidance, time orientation, how far we see the future, how, right, immediate short-term return or long-term. I think in business, we talk a lot about, right, should we care about next year's profit or the 10 years impact on the planet? Those will determine what actions or decisions we're going to make. And the 6th is indulgence and restraint. Like in my view, also kind of context. Should we just relax and enjoy life? Right? Or that's my interpretation about the dimension. And interestingly, there's currently a website called Cultural Factor. I did a thorough look and pull out the 4 countries' indexes. And on the 6th dimension, I'd like you spend a moment looking at the numbers. Anything surprising or interesting or counterintuitive?
China and Hong Kong stands out.
That's a great observation, right? So it seems like in Korea, the uncertainty avoidance is very high. So we have to think about, so I guess look into the detailed research. My guess is, I think there's some also of our UChicago's research talked about the big network. So individuals tend to take more risks because of the larger the country, the network, the safety, right, one may feel. So Korea is relatively small. So countries, individuals may tend to avoid, right, uncertainty.
But wouldn't you expect that same result in Hong Kong?
Good point. But I would argue that Hong Kong is part of a big, sits right next to a big, China here.
Right.
So people may also have the kind of a big backup in mind, right? And what may be driving the numbers, I think it's worth looking into. So that's a great question. And actually, one surprise is individualism, the second part of Americans, have been dropping significantly. Right, this is one of the updated numbers. The 60 actually has dropped, individualism for Americans, compared to earlier Hofstede index. And that has been explained because the individualism the most applicable to Caucasian. And while American as a melting pot, right, as more data are being collected, right, they found the individualism level is getting down, right, getting smaller. And in my view, I think people are aware of the cultural intelligence nowadays. And after we learn about the existence of such thing, then we tend to adapt, right? Once we adapt, we tend to start considering others. Individualism index may also go down. Okay, and my personal story I'd like to share with you is about the third part, motivation to success and achievement. And I was comparing two schools, very good schools in the East Coast that accepted my 12-year-old son. And one school is very highly academically, successful. And my girl is studying there. And the other one, academic achievement is not as strong, but is really encouraging community collaboration. So from someone like me, from very competitive world, motivation towards achievement success is quite high, right? In China, 66 index. Naturally, I feel I would be pulled to the academically strong, right, school. But I realized, right, as a family, we want to signal something we are going to emphasize more. So I pull myself and lean towards the other one that promotes more of a community collaboration, caring type of community. So I can even sense this level of influence, right? Once we learn about this factor, and we may be able to adapt. So that's why by the end of the talk, I like to talk about how we can do about learning cultural intelligence. What can we do about it? I guess these numbers got to change over time as we gather more and more intelligence.
Can you explain that power distance? Like, what is that telling us?
Yeah, power distance is how we feel about the inequality. If you're in a hierarchical society, right, you don't have much power, and how you feel that's acceptable or not by looking into the index. So in looking at the number, in China, it feels that's acceptable, right? In an institutional society, if you don't have much power, you feel that's acceptable, that's okay. And you listen to those who have more power, right? And whatever they ask you to do. But when power index is low, like US, right, it's more of a label, not like I'm really having power, ordering, doing things, because we feel everybody is equal. So more of equality. So that's I believe that's what this power index is measuring, the distance. It's interesting. I think Cliff and I once argued about the Korea's power distance, right? Being 60, we feel that's a bit of off. But over years, by looking at the numbers change, I feel it makes some sense. I think in South Korea, in Japan, yes, they're very East Asian, but they're also influenced a lot by the Western cultural. So individualism, equality has been emphasized in the society. So that's my feeling. So exactly right, how that number being measured, and that's my take on. You feel how acceptable it is to have the less power people, right, to take its position, his or her.
And then what's going on with indulgence?
Indulgence is versus restraint. I guess US American people are very much into indulgence.
Is that going up or down for the Americans?
That I have to look into that.
Okay.
What's your guess, Mark?
I don't know. I think it's always been high. It's probably constant.
After COVID.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, maybe globally. Right?
No, Americans are more like,
Americans.
yeah. I see
Why?
examples of that. Like I have a friend who don't drink Coke because he's afraid it's not healthy. But after COVID, he said, what the hell? He's been drinking Coke for like 3 times, 4 times a day.
Indulge even more.
Yeah.
But why that only applies to Americans?
Because he's thinking he may be dying soon. So that's the fact, you know? And he's a highly educated person.
Highly educated.
Yes, from one of the schools that you guys went to.
I think a lot of people after COVID, they stopped drinking alcohol, or they really slowed down their alcohol intake, which is kind of another interesting phenomenon. Wine sales in Napa Valley are way down since COVID.
It's a great point. That may argue against.
Yeah, which
Right.
may be also may be generational. They say young people aren't drinking. So it may be a generational thing as opposed to an overall.
But why is that, right? So one can argue, right, why, well, maybe we just indulge ourselves. But on the other hand, you know, life is so short. We need to take better care of ourselves, more discipline, right? And less indulgence. I think in marketing literature, there's hedonic consumption, versus so you are there for pleasure, right? Or you're there for some more pragmatic, utilitarian consumption. So it's a bit different, right? Self-regulation. It's also for better health. So I guess it also can be touching upon the time orientation, right? You want a short-term enjoyment, sacrificing the long-term health, or rather have, long-term oriented, healthy mind and have a little bit of self-constraint. So those are the index one may.
When I think of indulgence too, I think of consumer behavior, just in terms of Americans love their toys, they got to have their boat, their cars, all of this stuff. And that's why, in China, the consumer economy isn't as robust. People are thinking more about saving. They're thinking more about sending their kids to a good school.
Education, right?
Education.
There's a lot of emphasis on that.
Yeah.
And also similar, speaking of consumer behavior, there's a large literature also on when we win the lottery, should we spend money on traveling, experiential, or should we spend the money on luxury goods, right? Symbolic, right? Or watch expensive, right? That's also to reward yourself. And there's a kind of cultural differences out there.
Mm-hmm.
Westerners clearly tend to enjoy experience. Like, let's take a vacation somewhere. While Easterners tend to buy some more expensive items. So object oriented, or maybe education is another aspect, right? So also the logo, the brand may carry a very strong meaning in Asians' mind. But that kind of trend may also be changing, I guess. Yeah, so those are all interesting, yes.
Lie on the sampling method of this study, because some of the numbers is slightly counterintuitive to me as a Chinese. Yeah.
Yes, that's why I put the link there. They have a
Yeah.
detailed explanation. So I think that's a great point.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. So I like to summarize from my expertise, which is more of a psychological bias and the rationality in context, and also the cultural intelligence, which is a relatively new term on top of IQ, EQ, and nowadays we talked about CQ, cultural quotient intelligence, by a London Business School professor, I guess 20 years ago. So I think combined all those things will help us to think about the science behind cultural thinking. That's what I'd like to summarize, right, this part of my talk. And the real world consequences and cases, and very briefly, I'd like to summarize fields Westerners tend to focus on fast negotiation, direct communication, legal contracts, maybe. East Asians or Chinese decision makers may focus more on relationship building. I guess that's another term that's discussed a lot in the East Asian context, like 关系. 关系 is not exactly relationship, right? That's why a lot of Westerners, they may think, oh, take somebody out for dinner. That's how I build 关系, but I think 关系 is more sophisticated, right? So the long-term building connection, relationship building, indirect signaling, maybe in the East Asian context, I think in Japan, Korea, China a lot, right? We don't like to have the on the surface conflict. So we may not say no, but implicit no. That can confuse a lot of Westerners, right? Indirect signaling, and also build the long-term trust before making any commitment. So those are maybe some of the very salient styles between the West and the East, right? Middle Eastern, Latin relationship focused, hierarchical. I think this semester I had a very interesting Brazilian girl. She's from Brazil. I like to talk about how cultural is like in Brazil, right? A lot of interesting things I found closely related to East Asian, right? They're also very family oriented and relationship focused. And some of the real cases I like quickly go through, like Korean chaebol and US firm. Korean firms, very hierarchical, but internally they're often aligned. So that may slow down the decision-making process, which may confuse their US counterpart. US tend to focus more on the speedy decisions, individual responsibility. Outcome can be misunderstanding, project delays. Another real case, German-Japanese joint venture. German would like to focus on clear deadlines, direct communication. Japanese tend to have, similar to Korean, maybe not so much. I feel Chinese tend to be a bit more straightforward, maybe, indirect in communication, and focusing on group consensus. The earlier opening case I talked about, if there is a disagreement, should the Madam President decide how to allocate the bonus or get everybody on the same page to agree on the best allocation? So that can be a very different kind of decision process. Swedish company use Western value of individualism, but that may fail even in the Indian context. Indian market also focus on family collectivist influence. So without considering that aspect, the campaign can fail. So that's some of the real world consequences and cases to share. The last part is, after knowing the science, the real cases, what can we do about it? So I think the important thing, a key takeaway for all of us, is to study local cultural values, I think ultimately the value systems can be different, right? Boils down what basis to use. It's coming from various factors, but it's the value that will determine what we prioritize, right? We know setting goals is important, but what is the goal? Is the goal to maximize the company's profit for the next year, next 10 years, or maximize everybody's well-being? Those are different goals. And how to set up those goals, depending on the value system set up within the institution and organization. And the efficient way is to set mutual expectation up front, practice perspective taking. Next time, if you're interacting with people with different cultural background, you may want to practice thinking anything that I know, right, the other culture may not share. Do I really understand where they're coming from? I think that can be a useful practice. And finally, be flexible, adaptive, and patient. Slow down. I did prepare a couple of questions for us to think about any reflection that, or decisions that failed or succeeded due to cultural factors, and what would have been done differently. Okay, that's something that I hope to hear from the audience. As to conclude, a key takeaway from the Mission Impossible, I guess we have to thank Madam President for delaying decision, so save the planet, right? And
I need you to trust me. One last time.
let's hope we decide, not just based on big data, but based on empathy, cultural, and perspective. Thank you.
Who has questions? Anybody in the audience here in person? I'm interested in people from Hong Kong, how you feel about the chart she put up, you know, with Hong Kong relative to South Korea and the United States and China. Did you feel like that was a representative of your experience in any of those four categories? Yes.
My thoughts on that chart, maybe you can flip back to the chart, was,
Sure.
thank you so much, Professor. Is the power distance of Hong Kong is so close to China, etc., whereas we have been influenced by the British for so long already. What are your thoughts on this at this moment with a lot of MNCs in Hong Kong, global financial institution? How does this impact your thinking on the power distance?
So the power distance,
Yeah.
Hong Kong,
Compared to the US.
like 68,
Yeah.
right? It's still hierarchical, right? So people accept, I think it's the acceptance rate, right? The larger audience accept this power structure, the distance. I guess influenced by the East Asian kind of influence. Any other?
Survey.
You can use the
Employees with-
microphone in front of you here. Touch the button and you've got a microphone.
Okay.
So in other words, we're thinking the 68 is a bit high for Hong Kong,
Yeah.
but it's quite lower than China. China is 80,
Yeah.
right? We were debating about Korea being 60. We feel it's very hierarchical, right, in the Korean culture. But internally, I guess they're influenced by the Western, right? Like the same with Hong Kong.
Do you think this is on par with the UK in the Europe side? Because we don't have UK data here, right? So I'm just thinking because UK is should be quite hierarchical as well because of how the empire structure, etc. So just my logical guess.
That would have been my logical guess too. It's just influenced by British.
Yeah.
And that's very hierarchical in and of itself.
So your guess about UK would it be between 60 and 60? Is
Yeah,
also, we can find out. I think interactive if we have time.
Yeah.
You wanna, this web,
Take a look.
yeah,
Let's take a look.
take a look, right? Oh, let me, how do I exit?
I could speak to the debate we had, because at the time we were living in, like, half living in Beijing and half living in Seoul. And of course, Shali is originally from China and I'm originally from the US, but I've spent about 11 years of my life in Korea. I speak Korean. And at this time I was at Yonsei University, but I also was at Tsinghua. And so I had this direct comparison of hierarchy in Yonsei and hierarchy in Tsinghua University. And when I saw this data, I burst out laughing because Yonsei was so much more hierarchical than Tsinghua was. And you know, and it's hard to generalize that. I mean, those are just two elite universities. But I was shocked when I saw that data result, and maybe there's something that I don't understand, but I spent a lot of time responding immediately to what senior professors and faculty at Yonsei, you know, told me to do, including things like, you got to show up for this thing this Saturday, right? Versus in Beijing, it was a lot more discursive, and also it was more laid back. And I'm not sure about all of the cultural dynamics for that, but so I kind of think that data is varied, right? So I don't think the power distance data has been updated. I think the individual collectivism data has been updated, but I didn't have a chance to dig into it enough yet. So yeah, for me, the power distance findings have a bit of a question mark, but I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not the UK, you know, which way that one goes, because that may.
The
point
data
it.
shows 35.
Aha.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah, just UK now replaced Korea because maximum 4 nations. Yes, it means they really don't accept too big of a
Inequality.
power distance.
I do wonder if it's economics, right? If you think about economic inequality in these places, there's less in Korea and more in China, and there's less in the UK and more in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So if it's economic inequality, and that's kind of what that's reflecting, it might be, as opposed to straight out power, do what I say.
My guess is the reason we have issues with Korea, we know about the Korean airlines, like fatal crash is the co-pilot too worried about saying something to the pilot, right? Shows while in more of a lower index countries, right, it's just a label. And those people with less power, they can still put a lot of input to generate better outcome for the institutions. That's why we're very puzzled about Korean having such a low power index. But then as we pay more attention, I think we feel, right, I worked in Korean institutions for over 12 years now, right? You can speak up, maybe a foreigner is a bit different, but by observing, right, maybe the structure has been changing after the Korean Airlines crash. And for UK, I don't know too much about, but I feel this depending on the individual's view of the power structure. Right, in the organization, people have different titles, and ultimately, right, we're trying to jointly create a better outcome for institutions. So that may be explaining why UK may have 35, but I don't know if we can look into how they measure. But good question, thank you.
Are there big country, small country nuances to this data at all? Or like, I think about the US and I think about all the microcultures in the US, you know, our Bay Area where I'm from is so different from the Chicago culture, is so different from a Nashville culture, for example. Like, do you take into consideration, or do they take into consideration geographies?
That's a great point. I agree. Not only that, I think within University of Chicago, we feel the cultural differences within social science, physical science, and business school. I feel, pardon me, right? I mean, we are all the UChicago members. I feel at different divisions, or I have to, for example, in physical science, you tend to really want to call professor so-and-so. It's the cultural. I feel the power index is higher within physical science as opposed to in social and business school. That's I totally agree with Mark's point. So it's interesting. It would be interesting to look into within the U.S. different institutions and what might be shaping this power index, power distance index. Yeah, great point.
There's a question in the back. Sorry.
Thank you for the talk. I was going to ask you, like the case studies that you have, the couple of cases that you had before, is that from recent history or what timeline? And two, surely a lot of the corporation, I think global management, like they know about this, right? And how are you seeing they implementing the way they manage or the way how they run their business locally and also collectively as a global firm?
Those cases are relatively new. I use Harvard Business cases, and Mark also commented. I personally also wrote cases. So those examples relatively new in my view, unless you feel it's already outdated. What's your?
No, I would have sense that it would be surprising to see like I guess a joint venture in recent time, let's say in the last couple of years, to have that kind of conflict. You
Maybe
surely
not the last couple of years, or
Yeah.
last 10, 20 years. Yeah, this cultural intelligence idea came around 2003, 20 years.
Okay.
Good observation. Yes, no.
Yeah, I think the point that Mark made about sort of microcultures within these national societies gets back to the question that somebody raised earlier about how we'd really want to know a lot about the sampling in these cases before we.
One number captures
Right.
everything.
Right. I mean, one could easily imagine, and the same, with, I mean, the case studies are fascinating, but presumably, you're talking about, it's not just an American firm, working with a Korean firm or something. It's an American firm in a particular sector, working with a Korean firm in a particular sector, and a firm of a certain age, et cetera. I think we'd want to really drill down a lot deeper before we place too much emphasis on the national label alone.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, even within China, when I lived there in the 80s, we used to joke about, I lived in Chengdu, and we talked about Li Huangdi Yuan, so we were far from the central government and the power.
We don't have to listen, right?
And it was just like just so much more relaxed and free culture. But I'm talking too much. I heard we have some UChicago students in the audience tonight, and I heard they might have questions for you, Professor Wu. So Adi, you want to go first, and then we'll go to Ravi. Adi, go ahead.
Thank you for your time. My name is Adi. I'm a second year at the college. I wanted to ask a question. I'll just preface it with saying that, like, I think many of us know, for example, in like advanced technologies, for example, there's a big difference between the East Asian perspective on work culture versus the Western perspective on work culture. Just like one example would be, I heard that if a machine breaks down at like a company like TSMC in Taiwan at 11 p.m. on a Friday, that it'll get fixed by 2 a.m. on Saturday. Whereas if that happens in the US, it'll be fixed on Monday at 9 a.m. So I guess with that prefacing my question, is there research around how much time or what factors are kind of necessary to change someone or population's perspective on, say, work culture, or just mindset around work?
It's not just the mindset. Like I said, once we adapt some of the, thank you for the question, right? The cultural issues. I think the same with East Asian companies also reflecting. I just had my students discussing Coupang. Right? Coupang had constantly employees, like fatal deaths because they work so hard. I experienced they can deliver 1 a.m. you order, right? They're really emphasizing on the rocket delivery and the sacrifice of the employees' health. Right? And even Korean government intervened by giving Coupang the fine, but unfortunately still it's going on. I guess it may take a while for the society, companies to have that kind of different mindset. I think mindset can be changed. As explained, my personally already walking away from individual competitiveness. I feel we should jointly care about each individual's well-being and give it some time. That may be changed. Same to China and to Japan or Taiwan. You mentioned a great question here.
Ravi?
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Ravi. I'm a rising third year at the college, and I know that this isn't directly related to your talk, but I wanted to know if any of these statistics shown today have any implications for education between all of the countries we talked about. I know that in the United States, is definitely, especially from my hometown of New York City, it's a very huge debate on how cultural motivation to individualism can affect people reaching into higher education. And I wanted to know if you have any words or any research about that.
Yes, I think that definitely applies to education, right? The cultural factors. I think East Asians emphasis a lot on education. And where you're from, New York City, you feel people are criticizing lacking of emphasis on education or too much?
Well, in particular, we have this high school admissions test called the Specialized High School Admissions Test. And there's a huge debate on whether that test should be abolished or not. And it's become kind of like a culture war, especially because it seems like minorities in the state have really difficulty getting into these high schools. So there's a huge debate on like, should we be prioritizing? Is this test indirectly a means of discrimination in the city?
My personal view, I'm going back and forth. I grew up in a very highly competitive environment, emphasizing a lot on education. I can see the merits of focusing a lot on the standardized test, right, to motivate individuals to work harder. But after going to UChicago, I was exposed to more of the Western way of education. I think education can be successful without emphasizing a lot on tests, but be careful about going too far. I think the answer would be balanced. And I know then the next level of question is how to balance, at what point might be the most optimal, right? I think that will have to be incorporating some of the cultural factors. I think the danger is we're emphasizing on one thing that can have a lot of mental breakdowns, right? That's something we should definitely avoid. So what might be the criteria for having the best balance? I think that's the question we need to look into. So I hope that definitely can apply to education.
Any other questions in the audience or online? We haven't had any questions online. If you want to submit a question, or anybody else in the audience got a question?
Yeah, I could ask something. I guess I was just,
yeah, there you go.
I think I was just curious about I think it was your study you shared about how they're looking at the sort of boxes and the different perspectives. And I guess I was kind of wondering, I guess if you could share a little more context on how many people you studied and maybe any intersectional lines in which you found maybe even more differences in terms of whether or not they were incorporating the other perspective or not. Particularly, it could be gender, wealth, or anything like that. I was kind of wondering, was there any kind of further nuances?
I see. Good question. I think we first did a study with English, right? And we didn't really found much of a difference. That's why I feel language is also plays a very important role when it comes to shape the way we think about things. So once we change to the speaking Chinese, the differences is very robust. In terms of gender differences, no, right? But our further data analysis reveal universally everybody started being egocentric, starting from the self-view. But the Chinese data showed more of faster adaptation. So there's a nuanced millisecond data reveal. It's the adaptation. It's like we were born the same, but given the society's training or like a muscle training, East Asians may learn to adapt more quickly. So that's, further details about the finding. I don't know if that addressed your, a great question.
I'm curious how you conduct this research at your university now. Do you have a lab? Like, how does that
My
work?
university in Korea, no. So I have to thank UChicago for providing such a great lab facility. My current, like mostly for business cases, that's why I'm more into the company's interviews and the data. Yeah, that
Do you
level.
foresee like more of that kind of research being done in Asia through?
In Asia, definitely. When I was at Tsinghua, I think we set up the eye tracking, equipment that's more of a very research heavy oriented. Yeah. But my current institution is more of, instructor case based.
I see. Okay. I had one more question about your 4 Ps and your 4 Cs.
Okay.
Because I don't know if you want to go back to that slide, but when I think about value, I think about intangibles. And I was wondering where in that slide, in the Ps or the Cs, like where do intangible values come in? Like Ken and I were talking about an opportunity we have for this campus, for example, and there's a price, there's an opportunity that's directly related to, working with this particular party. But I always think about what are the intangibles of working with them that aren't directly related to, okay, they pay money, we deliver this. There's always something else, other layers of a negotiation that I don't know that they're reflected in Ps and Cs, the intangible pieces.
Yeah, intangible I would put it still under the value part. It's just that value may take a bit longer time to show. Right. And also a lot of value is not just monetary value. Right. There's some social capital, right? Your network. And those kind of capital value returns may not be immediately visible. So it's like intangible, we talked about products, intangible, like the services, right? Your dental appointment, those kind of things, it's hard to touch, right? But they are there. And I think it's similar, the value includes the value that we may not be immediately seeing. I like to link to also the time frame, right? That kind of concept. I hope that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the talk tonight, Professor Wu. I think you brought a lot of value to our campus with this talk this evening.
Well, thank
and
you.
all the people that joined. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You'll stick around if people have questions that can come up. I just have to give a few announcements to close out, just some housekeeping here. So our next Nexus talk is by Amir Hempel from NYU Shanghai. And he's going to be talking about Unruly Spirits, the Rise of Chinese Medicine Therapies for Autism and ADHD, which I think is really fascinating. I think last week I mentioned we have 2 Nexus talks on autism. So let's hear what Amir Hempel, Professor Hempel has to say about that. That's on July 24th at 6:30 p.m. Professor Hempel is a UChicago PhD alumnus in comparative human development. So we're going to be excited to have him in a couple weeks. And then I wanted to also mention we have a really amazing program. Professor Robert Pape, who's somebody that this campus has worked with a lot when we did our presidential election series, just this past election series. He was a great partner for the campus. We did all of our programming online, but I'm really excited, and thanks to Professor Pomerantz for working with us to enable Professor Pape not only to come to this campus next week in person and give a talk, but also to do a tour of China and do interviews and visiting places like BYD. So he's going to be here next week on Thursday, June 26th. Professor Pomerantz is going to moderate a talk by Professor Pape. The topic is why the U.S. is frightening the world and what this means for China. And if you go on our webpage, you'll see like a description of this topic. We've already got a lot of people signed up for it. So if you want to sign up for this next week, we're going to have it in the Grand Hall. I would suggest that you register as soon as possible and claim your seat. So we're excited to have Professor Pape here next week, and I hope you can attend that program. Don't forget, we have about 150 UChicago faculty on the course podcast, which you can find on all the podcast platforms. I listen to the Apple Podcast platform, and the professors talk about their journey for how they became professors. So we're really excited. That's a Hong Kong campus production. We're really proud of it. So I hope you can take a listen to that. And thank you for joining tonight online and in person. And thank you for Professor Wu. If you have any questions, I'm sure Professor Wu will stay behind and answer your questions for you. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.